As the strange, relentless rain began pouring across the world, it quickly turned into a global disaster. But this wasn't an ordinary storm. The most terrifying thing about the rain was that whenever it touched a door or window, it somehow sealed it completely shut. Jason tried everything to open his front door, but it wouldn't move. Desperate, he grabbed a metal bar and smashed it against the window with all his strength, but the glass had somehow become stronger than bulletproof glass. And then something even stranger happened. The cracks he had just created slowly began to disappear as the rainwater touched the window, repairing the damage right in front of his eyes. But Jason had no idea that being trapped inside his house was only the beginning. Outside, the world had already changed, and dangerous creatures now seemed to be taking control. As soon as the mysterious rain began, the internet went down across the world. Panic quickly spread through the neighborhood, and Jason soon realized that his house wasn't the only one affected. Around the same time, his neighbor Susan returned from a jog. The moment she saw what was happening to the houses, she panicked and immediately ran toward the police station to get help. After she left, the remaining neighbors gathered together, trying to figure out what was going on. Everyone had a different theory. Some believed it was a new military weapon, while others were convinced that aliens had invaded Earth. For the moment, everyone was still trapped safely inside their homes. But Jason had a feeling that things were about to get much worse. Just in case, he prepared his gun. Then night came, but Susan never returned. Jason began to worry. He tried using a drill to break through the door, but one drill bit after another snapped while the lock remained completely untouched. Even worse, every hole he managed to make slowly sealed itself as soon as the rainwater reached it. Jason tried breaking through the walls. He even tore into the floor. Nothing worked. It was as if the rain had created an unbreakable prison around the house, completely cutting them off from the outside world. And by now, Jason was starting to realize one terrifying truth. Whatever was causing this strange rain, it was clearly not human technology. The next morning, Jason and his wife rushed downstairs, hoping something had changed, but the doors and windows were still sealed shut. By now, they had to face the possibility that they might be trapped there for a very long time. Luckily, Jason had spent years reading survival and post-apocalyptic books, so the first thing he did was check their food and water supplies. For now, they still had running water and electricity, but Jason knew they couldn't count on that forever. They would have to ration everything. After doing the math, he estimated that if everyone ate carefully, the family could survive for about 2 months. A week slowly passed, but nothing changed. The doors and windows remained completely sealed. Jason's wife, Anne, even started saving the seeds from the tomatoes they ate, hoping they could grow their own food if things got worse. Unfortunately, their neighbors weren't doing as well. Max and his family, who lived across the street, were already running dangerously low on food. Jason wanted to help them, but he was trapped inside his own home, just like everyone else. Outside, the rain continued without stopping. At least the family still had each other, and somehow they managed to pass the time. Then one day, their daughter Ruth noticed something outside the window. For just a second, she thought she saw a human-like figure moving past the house, but when she told everyone else, no one had seen anything. Over the next month, Ruth began noticing something strange. Whenever the rain became especially heavy, the mysterious figure would appear again. And the strangest part was, Ruth was the only one who could see it. Meanwhile, their food supply was slowly running out. Anne had planted the vegetable seeds, but it would take time before anything was ready to eat. Then, one night, Jason and Anne finally got a rare moment alone. For a brief moment, they tried to forget everything that was happening around them, but then they looked toward the window and froze. A dog was standing outside, staring directly at the house. It stayed there silently for a few moments, then suddenly ran away. That was when Jason and Anne began to realize that the world outside was no longer the same, and little by little, one terrifying possibility became impossible to ignore. Maybe humans were no longer in control out there. As time passed, Christmas finally arrived. Jason and Anne couldn't afford to give their children any new presents, but their older son, Gray, had something special for his mother. The first tomato they had managed to grow inside the house. It was small, but to them, it meant hope. It proved that they might eventually be able to survive without relying on the food they had left. But then, Ruth looked toward Max's house. Something was clearly wrong. Max and his family were running out of food, and hunger had become their biggest enemy. The elderly couple had been suffering from starvation for far too long, and their condition was getting worse. Then one night, as heavy rain poured outside and lightning flashed across the sky, Ruth heard a strange sound. Anne looked looked through the window and suddenly saw a woman standing outside. It was Susan, the same Susan who had left on the first day of the mysterious rain to find help. But what had happened to her during the past month? She looked completely different. Susan seemed desperate to say something, but before anyone could understand her, something suddenly dragged her away into the darkness. Terrified, Jason immediately closed the curtains. Was there really some kind of creature outside? Until now, it seemed like Ruth was the only person in the family who had actually seen what it looked like. And maybe there was a reason for that. The creature only seemed to appear when the rain became especially heavy. Jason now knew one thing for sure. Whatever was outside, it wasn't human. Days continued to pass, and eventually, even boredom became another problem for the trapped family. Then, suddenly, a loud crash came from inside the chimney. The top section had collapsed and fallen down, but instead of panicking, Ruth suddenly came up with an idea. What if they could escape through the chimney? But Jason quickly realized there was a problem. The chimney was far too narrow for an adult to squeeze through, so Jason and Gray built a simple rope and pulley system. Then, they carefully lowered Ruth into the chimney, hoping she might be able to find a way outside. The house was old, and part of the brick wall near the chimney had already collapsed, leaving a large opening. Ruth slowly climbed higher and higher, and then, after being trapped inside for so long, her hand finally reached the open air outside. For the first time in months, the family thought they might actually have found a way to escape, but their relief didn't last long. Suddenly, they heard their dog crying out in pain. That's when reality hit them. Their dog had been suffering from a heart condition and needed medication regularly, but trapped inside the house, they had no way to get more. And now, the medicine was gone. Jason watched helplessly as his dog continued to suffer. Finally, with a heavy heart, he quietly asked Anne to take the kids into the bedroom. Anne immediately understood what he was about to do. She took the children inside and turned up the TV. Jason picked up his gun and made the heartbreaking decision to end his dog's suffering. But that created another problem. The dog had been part of their family for years. Jason couldn't even imagine the thought of eating him, but they were running out of food, and survival was changing the rules. With no other choice, Jason stored the remaining meat in the refrigerator. It might be the only thing keeping his family alive. After that, whenever the rain became especially heavy, Jason immediately closed every curtain in the house. By now, they were convinced that whatever those creatures were, they only came out during the heaviest rain. One day, Ruth noticed that one of their potted plants was still sitting outside. They carefully tried to bring it back inside, and luckily, nothing happened. But time kept moving. 3 months passed, and food was becoming their biggest problem. The family was running out of options. If they didn't find another source of food soon, they could all starve to death. Then Jason noticed something. Small animals were still moving around outside, and suddenly, he had an idea. Using an old skateboard and a few sharp tools, Jason built a simple trap. He used some of the remaining meat as bait and carefully lowered the trap outside through the chimney. Soon, hungry animals began following the smell, and finally, after 3 long months, the family had real food again. For the first time, they had a decent source of protein. But this wasn't just a meal, it was hope. Jason and his family finally began to believe they could survive inside this sealed house. Eventually, escaping stopped being their main goal. Now, there was only one thing that mattered: survival. They even tore up parts of the floor and started growing vegetables inside the house. Everything around them now had a single purpose: keeping the family alive. Then eventually, the electricity went out completely. But by then, Jason and his family had already learned how to survive without it. Days turned into months. Months turned into years, and before they knew it, 5 years had passed. During that time, the family had completely changed. They grew their own food, trapped animals for meat, and learned to survive using whatever they could find inside their home. The house they once thought of as a prison had slowly become their entire world, and after 5 long years, Jason and his family had learned how to survive completely on their own, in a world that had become strange, dangerous, and almost impossible to recognize. By the time 5 years had passed, both kids were much older, but as they entered their teenage years, they had also become more rebellious and short-tempered. After all, they had spent their entire childhood trapped inside a sealed house. Growing up in a place like that, it was impossible to expect them to live like normal kids. One night, heavy rain and lightning returned. Following their old rule, the family immediately covered every window, and Jason had a good reason to be careful. Over the past 5 years, they had learned that the terrifying creatures outside didn't just seem to control control the rain, they were also hunting any humans who had managed to survive. But as dangerous as the outside world was, the kids were becoming more curious about it. They had spent years staring at the same walls, and now they desperately wanted to know what was out there. Meanwhile, Ruth had discovered something important about the creatures. Whenever one of them passed by, a strange liquid would drip from its body. Ruth studied it carefully and realized it contained a large amount of salt. It was almost like seawater, which raised a terrifying question. Had these mysterious creatures come from the depths of the ocean? Then one day, something happened that the family hadn't seen in years. A thin beam of sunlight entered the house. Everyone froze. Could it be? After 5 years of non-stop rain, was the storm finally coming to an end? But as the rain began to disappear, a new and even more dangerous problem appeared. Everywhere the creatures had left their salty liquid, the soil became contaminated. The plants and crops the family had worked so hard to grow began to die. Even worse, the rainwater they had collected over the years had become salty too, and now the rain was stopping. If they didn't find a source of clean water soon, they wouldn't die from hunger this time. They would die from thirst. Then suddenly, Ruth screamed. The family's automatic trap had caught a wild weasel. Ruth looked at the animal and wondered if they could keep it instead of killing it for food. But the moment she got too close, the weasel suddenly bit her hand. That was a serious problem. A bite from a wild animal could cause a dangerous infection, and later that night, Ruth developed a high fever. Their medicine had run out years ago. If they didn't find help soon, Ruth might not survive. Jason knew he had only one option left. He had to take a risk. He pulled out his old car, which he had carefully maintained for the past 5 years. Then he floored the accelerator and slammed straight into the garage door. Crash. The car was badly damaged, but somehow the garage door didn't even break. It was still completely sealed, just as strong as before. Jason stood there, devastated. Then he looked down and noticed something on the ground, a crack. For the first time in 5 years, they had finally found a possible way out of the house. The house was already old, and its foundation had been slowly weakening over time. Jason realized that the impact from the car had caused the ground beneath the garage to crack, and now that the rain had finally stopped, the strange water could no longer repair the damage. This might be their family's only chance to escape. Jason immediately began tearing up the floor. He ripped away the tiles and started digging beneath them, and after years of being trapped inside that house, his hard work finally began to pay off. By the time Jason finally broke through the floor, he discovered a large passage underneath the house. But this wasn't just some random tunnel. It was part of the main sewer system, connecting their house to others throughout the neighborhood. Then Jason remembered something important. Their neighbor was a dentist. There was a chance he might still have antibiotics in his house, and with Ruth still recovering from the bite, they couldn't afford to wait. Anne was the smallest and thinnest member of the family, so she was the only one who could fit through the narrow passage. She tied a rope around her waist and slowly climbed down into the darkness. As she crawled deeper through the sewer, she eventually came across several loose bricks blocking the way. She carefully pulled them aside and continued forward. But when she finally reached the dentist's house, she found something horrifying. The dentist and his entire family had been dead for years. Nothing remained except their dried skeletons. Water had been leaking through the roof for years, leaving the entire house damaged and abandoned. Then suddenly, lightning flashed outside, and moments later, the rain started again. Anne immediately realized she had to hurry. She searched through the house as fast as she could and eventually found several bottles of antibiotics. But just as she was about to leave, she heard something outside. One of the creatures was nearby. By now, Anne had figured out something important about them. Their eyesight wasn't very good, but their hearing was incredibly sharp. So Anne held her breath and slowly made her way back toward the sewer, trying not to make a sound. The creature was getting closer, but Anne managed to squeeze back through the narrow passage just in time. Jason immediately sealed the opening with the loose bricks, trapping the creature on the other side. Anne made it home safely, and after taking the antibiotics, Ruth slowly began to recover, but their problems were far from over. The creatures now knew they were there. They knew humans were still hiding inside the house, and sooner or later, they would come back. The family realized they couldn't just sit there and wait anymore. They needed to escape, and after thinking it through, they came up with a desperate plan. Their only chance was to wait for one of the creatures to open the house, and escape the moment it did. So everyone immediately started gathering whatever they could find. Using everything they had left, the family built a trap. They didn't need to kill the creature, they just needed to hold it in place for a few seconds. A few seconds could be enough for the entire family to escape, and with that, they prepared for their most dangerous plan yet. They were going to lure the creature into the house and trap it. But things didn't go as planned. The creature never came inside. Instead, water pressure suddenly began building throughout the house. Within minutes, water started flooding in from every direction. It was almost as if the creature had decided not to attack them directly. Instead, it was going to drown them inside their own home. Luckily, everyone in the family knew how to swim, so they quickly changed their plan. Anne prepared several bottles of flammable liquid while Jason focused on distracting and weakening the creature. Then finally, their trap started to work. The water slowly began to drain away, and eventually, the creature became trapped. Jason immediately pointed his gun at it. He threatened to kill it if it didn't open the door. But then Ruth stopped him. She had seen this creature several times before, and somehow, she never believed it was as dangerous as the others. Ruth suggested that if they let it go, maybe it would help them escape. For Jason, trusting his daughter was a huge risk. But after spending 5 years trapped inside that house, they didn't have much left to lose. So in the end, Jason trusted Ruth, and luckily, she was right. The creature didn't hurt them. Instead, it opened a way out. For the first time in 5 years, Jason and his family finally stepped outside. But the moment they did, they realized the danger wasn't over. Other creatures were waiting nearby. For a moment, it seemed like there was no way they would survive. But somehow, the creature from inside the house seemed to communicate with the others, because instead of attacking, the creatures simply let the family go. Behind them, their old house slowly began to collapse. The same house that had trapped them for 5 years was also the reason they had survived. Outside, the entire city was underwater. Everywhere they looked, there was nothing but destruction and floodwater. But after surviving 5 years in a world that had completely changed, Jason and his family weren't ready to give up. They found a boat and began moving through the flooded city, searching for a place they could finally call home again. And after everything they had been through, they realized one important thing. The rain had finally stopped, but their old lives were never coming back. But that didn't mean their lives were over. They were entering a completely new world, a world where humans and these mysterious creatures might not have to be enemies forever. And somewhere in that strange new world, there was still hope.